Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In the last video we have discussed the operant conditioning theory of Skinner and the operations involved in the operant conditioning. Today we are going to deal with schedules for reinforcement. Before that, just recall what we know about reinforcement. Reinforcement is a stimulus whose presentation or removal increases the probability of a response. Now, schedules for reinforcement. The arrangement of reinforcement are vital in the learning process that involves reinforced techniques. Such arrangements are termed as schedule for reinforcement. Generally, two types of schedules for reinforcement. First one continuous and second one partial or intermittent. Partial or intermittent reinforcement classified into two categories, interval and ratio. Interval schedule further classified into fixed interval schedule and variable interval schedule. Similarly, ratio schedule further classified into fixed ratio schedule and variable ratio schedule. Now, let's learn each in detail. Continuous reinforcement. Every instance of a behavior is reinforced. That is, every correct response is reinforced. Best example for continuous reinforcement is giving chocolates every day when a child finishes homework. That means for every instance, we are reinforcing the response continuously. Whereas intermittent reinforcement is not every correct response is reinforced. Intermittent reinforcement is further classified into interval schedule and ratio schedule. In the case of interval schedule, reinforcement is based on the passage of time. Examples for every 3 minutes or 5 minutes, reinforcement is provided. Here, length of time between reinforcers is considered. Interval schedule is again classified into fixed interval schedule and variable interval schedule. In the case of fixed interval schedule, the requirements for reinforcements are always the same. That means the passage of time between two reinforcements is fixed. Examples for fixed interval schedule is providing salary to the teacher at the end of the month. Another example, a course where there are exams every 3 weeks. From these two examples, we can say that the time when the reinforcement is provided is same. Providing salary to the teacher at the end of the month. Here, at every month, the teacher is reinforced with the salary at the end of the month. So, the time when the reinforcement is provided is fixed. The teacher can expect the reinforcement at a particular time and the time will not vary. That's what we call fixed interval schedule. Whereas in the case of variable interval schedule, the requirement for reinforcement changes randomly. Here, the time when the reinforcement is provided cannot be predicted. The time may vary. Examples are checking your phone for text message and we do not know when we will be rewarded with a message. We cannot predict the time of reinforcement here. Simply we can say that variable interval schedule is a reinforcement is given at a varying interval of time. Interval varies in a random order also. Such type of schedule is known as variable interval schedule. Because first reinforcement can be done after 3 minutes, next can be done after 10 minutes, another reinforcement can be provided after 15 minutes. So the time gap between reinforcement may vary. Second category of intermittent reinforcement is ratio schedule. Here reinforcement is based on the number of behavior required. Here reinforcement is based on the number of behavior required. The classification comes under ratio schedules are fixed ratio schedule and variable ratio schedule. First, fixed ratio schedule. Here reinforcement is provided after a fixed number of correct responses have been made. Examples: after every correct 5 response, reinforcement is given. Students may be given a prize after reading 10 books, or giving a child candy every time she picks up her toys. In this case, reinforcement is provided only after fixed number of correct responses. In the case of variable ratio schedule, reinforcement is provided after a variable number of correct responses. Examples: first reinforcement is given after 5 correct responses, then it is given after 7 correct responses, etc. Examples for variable ratio schedule: buying lottery ticket and winning occasionally. Another example is playing poker. Here the player do not win every time but must play in order to have a chance. These are the two examples for variable ratio schedule. Skinner was of the view that learning of a response takes place quickly if every correct response is reinforced, but is forgotten easily when the reinforcement is stopped. If reinforcement is given after varying number of correct responses or at a varying number of time, the response is remarkably resistant to the extinction. So, reinforcement schedule is classified into continuous reinforcement and intermittent reinforcement. Here in the case of continuous reinforcement schedule, presenting a reinforcer after every appropriate response, whereas intermittent reinforcement schedule presenting a reinforcement after some but not for all responses. In interval schedule, the reinforcement is based on the length of time between the reinforcements. In the case of ratio schedule, reinforcement based on the number of responses between reinforcers. And fixed interval, reinforcement after a set period of time. Now let's move on to next topic, educational implication of Skinner's learning theory. First educational implication is learning objectives should be defined very specifically in terms of behavior. Second one is objectives should be arranged in order from simple to complex. Third one, for developing motivation in students for classroom work or activity, reinforcements like praise, blame, grade, etc. should be used. Next point is proper use of positive and negative gestures also serves as reinforcements. Next one is reinforcement should be used periodically so that the possibility of extinction of the desired behavior is resisted. Next one is in classroom the principle of immediate response or a reinforcement is very important. Praise for a job done well given immediately can be a stronger motivator than a grade given much later. Last point is punishment or punishing a student for undesirable behavior is not the proper step. Ignore it and wait for the gradual extinction. Punishment simply suppresses the behavior for the moment, and when the threat of the punishment is removed, behavior returns to its original level. Now, let's look into the comparison between classical and operant conditioning theory. Classical conditioning theory is done by Russian psychologist Pavlov, Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, whereas operant conditioning is done by American psychologist B.F. Skinner. Pavlov experimented on dogs, whereas B.F. Skinner done his experimented on rats and pigeons. Classical conditioning is called Pavlovian or type 1 learning, whereas operant conditioning is known as Skinnerian or type 2 learning. Classical conditioning is a S-type conditioning where emphasis is given to the stimulus, whereas operant conditioning is an R-type conditioning where emphasis is given to response. In the case of classical conditioning, the occurrence of conditioned response is forced by unconditioned stimulus. The occurrence of conditioned response is forced by unconditioned stimulus. Whereas in the case of operant conditioning, response is more spontaneous and voluntary in operant conditioning. In classical conditioning, the law of contiguity is the basis of association between stimulus-response. Whereas in operant conditioning, the law of effect is the basis of association between stimulus-response. In classical conditioning, pairing between unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus occurs. Whereas in the case of operant conditioning, pairing is taken place between response and the reinforcing stimulus which follows. In the case of classical conditioning, there is a bondage between specific unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, reinforcement takes the first place as food is presented first to elicit the response, whereas in the case of operant conditioning, reinforcement comes after the response is made by the organism. In classical conditioning, focus is on the single stimulus-response bondage, whereas in operant conditioning, concerned with the sequence of responses. Classical conditioning lays stress on time control, whereas operant conditioning stress on motivation and reward. Pavlov showed that stimulus substitution is the essence in learning process, and B.F. Skinner showed response modification is the essence in learning process. In the case of classical conditioning, the respondent behavior is considered as an internal process, whereas in the case of operant conditioning, operational behavior is an external process. The organism operates on the environment. These are the comparative study between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So that's all about today's video. Thank you for watching this video. Stay tuned. Have a good day.